This week, I sit down with Ron Kampeas, the Washington bureau chief of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, to dig into some recent controversies around a high-profile Jewish organization. And interestingly enough, our conversation ended up covering some of the core political conflicts in the Jewish world. So, let's get to it. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. Just to explain what prompted this episode and to provide context, there's this organization called the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. It's an umbrella group made up of 51 Jewish organizations that range across the political and denominational spectrum. And this thing, the Conference of Presidents, or the COP for short, has some high-minded and arguably very important aspirations. Its website says that the conference, quote, advances the interests of the American Jewish community, sustains broad-based support for Israel, and addresses the critical concerns facing world Jewry, end quote. And how does the conference do this? Well, according to its website, by being the place where, quote, diverse segments of the Jewish community come together in mutual respect to deliberate vital national and international issues, end quote. Now, this is a lot of lobbying speak full of buzzwords, but I'm reading this because it's a sham, and I want to be clear about that dissonance. The image that the conference projects is BS, in that most of what the conference actually does nowadays is serve as a place for organizations to argue. And a lot of those arguments lately revolve around a guy named Mort Klein, who is the president of the right-wing pro-Israel Zionist Organization of America, or ZOA for short, which is a member of the conference. Klein regularly tweets, writes, and says inflammatory things broadly seen as racist and Islamophobic, and has made a habit of basically calling left-wing Jewish groups terrorists, to the point that the ZOA got an official reprimand from the Conference of Presidents for being offensive. And all this brings me to one of the most recent COP controversies, and bear with me on this because it is a bit convoluted. The COP has a chairperson position that is elected every 2 years, and earlier this year, a woman named Diane Loeb was nominated to be the next chairperson. Now, previously, Loeb was chair of the board at HIAS, the Jewish Refugee and Immigration Organization, formerly known as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. HIAS has gotten in a lot of fights with the Trump administration over immigration issues, and HIAS is sort of the left-wing boogeyman for the Jewish right wing, so Mort Klein and the ZOA raised a big fuss about opposing Loeb as chairperson, and threatened that Loeb wouldn't be listened to by the Trump administration. HIAS is also a member of the COP. Now, I'm skipping over all of the broader HIAS versus Jewish right-wing drama, partly because the conversation with Kampeas covers it, and partly because I really think it's irrelevant. According to reporting by Kampeas, the White House was fine with Loeb becoming the COP's next chairperson, so long as immigration wasn't an issue she talked about. And guess what? The COP covers foreign policy, so immigration is not on their agenda, so Loeb would have been okay. But at the end of the day, Klein's right-wing PR campaign against Loeb sort of worked. Loeb was confirmed in April on a vote of 31 organizations for and 8 against to be not chairperson of the COP, but chairperson-elect of the COP, with the idea that she would be trained in for a year and then become the chairperson. No previous chairperson had this arrangement. They were just voted on, and boom, they started the job. And here's the thing. Here's why I have a whole episode of this podcast about this. If none of what I just said made any sense, congratulations. I don't get it either. But a few weeks ago, all of a sudden, I see a whole lot of noise in the institutional Jewish world at a legacy organization that sounds really important, but it's all sort of nonsensical fluff. But fluff that took up too much Jewish brain space. And if I sound angry, it's because I am. There are so many things happening in the world right now, and a legacy Jewish organization found the time to waste on drama that I can guarantee most American Jews don't know, understand, or care about. And then people ask why legacy Jewish organizations struggle to stay relevant. It drives me up the wall. And I should also note that I really deeply hate right-wing Jews who go after Hayas and people associated with Hayas because my Soviet Jewish family ended up in the United States thanks to Hayas. So it's a bit personal. But setting that aside, all of this really boils down to a question of what exactly the Conference of Presidents is for and why anyone should care about any of this stupid drama, which is really, at the end of the day, a question about the legitimacy of Jewish institutional and communal unity in this country. So I grilled Ron Kampeas, the Washington bureau chief of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, for the past 17 years all about this, because he's been reporting on this stuff. And I should definitely apologize to him for my at times aggressive questioning and my inability to hide my absolute disgust with this Jewish institutional politicking. I just hope this episode provides some clarity to us regular Jews when thinking about what our institutional leaders are doing in our name. This conversation has been edited for length and clarity. Enjoy. Let's start with the basic of basic questions. Can you explain what exactly the Conference of Presidents does and what it's for? And I mean that not just in a, why Jewish institutions care about what it does, but for Jews who have no idea what this group is, what is it really that the conference does? And, what's so great about it?
So the genesis of it was in the late 1950s. And I'm not sure the names of the Jewish characters at the time, but Eisenhower, who didn't have a great relationship with the Jewish community because of his coldness towards Israel, for among other reasons, was getting representations from different Jewish organizations, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League. And he finally said, or somebody on his behalf said, get your act together, just have one voice. I can't take all these meetings. And so that led to the creation of a group that could speak with one voice on foreign policy, principally for the Jewish community. There have been separate efforts to speak on domestic policy, but this was principally about foreign policy. And so that's how it started. And so its function is to basically, ideally its function would be like it would have a few people in a room with people from the executive branch, either the president himself or others. And they would have, the people on the Jewish side would have a unified voice. That's never quite worked out. So the function is to get these people into a room and they can say what they are unified about. They can show the degree of diversity on other issues. And that's how it's played out.
Could you get a little bit more specific about explaining? I mean, is there a specific policy victory or sort of, because, what I'm hearing is a bunch of Jewish organizations get together to go talk to who's ever president at whatever time. And I'm just trying to sort of get a more concrete explanation for people as to what do they do?
So in terms of unity in recent years, I guess the big policy victory would be that the conference in the late 1980s, in the 1980s, unified around the issue, and it was a very easy issue to unify around, was of Soviet Jewry. And so that made it clear to the, to an administration like the Reagan administration and then the George H.W. Bush administration, who were already sympathetic to the whole issue of trying to ease conditions for minorities in the Soviet Union, allow Jews to leave the Soviet Union. It made it effectively showed that there was one Jewish voice in terms of supporting those. The more recent big story, I think, and it's recent, it's 15 years old, but of a policy unity that was, I think, of significance was when Israel was pulled out of Gaza in 2005, and it generated a lot of dissent in Israel. I mean, I think there was majority support for the pullout. There was majority support for this pullout, but the dissent, the minority, was very loud. It was at times violent. It was kind of scary for Israelis who fear nothing more than a civil war among the Jewish Israelis. And then you had, there was a degree of dissent among the American Jewish community as well. And so what the conference was able to provide the Bush administration and the Sharon government at the time was unified Jewish voice saying, this is okay, you can pull out of Gaza. There was dissent within the conference, but it was, from the Zionist Organization of America on the right wing at the time, but it was relatively muted because of the unanimity of the entire of everybody else who was on the Conference of Presidents at the time. And I think that was significant. It wasn't like a front page story, but it was significant, and it helped the Bush administration go forward with its plans for peace in the Middle East.
Are there any big or significant recent policy wins or anything like that?
Just none that I can think of. I can't think of anything that the Conference of Presidents has done in recent years in terms of policy. I mean, the weird thing about the Conference of Presidents until its recent change of leadership is, in a way, how isolated it has been from the American Jewish consensus. I mean, Malcolm Honline, the executive vice chairman of the conference for decades, and that means he's the top professional leader there. But so he's the executive vice chairman, and he's gone from like being in the 1980s representative of a real consensus of issue for Jewish people. He came out of the Soviet Jewry movement, and so he had that. And he was considered to be a really able advocate for Soviet Jewry. And when I say that the Reagan administration was friendly, they were friendly, but they needed ideas, they needed contacts in the Soviet Union, and that was what Malcolm was good at. And so that it went from that kind of effectiveness to this weird isolation. And the story that really perked up my ears that I wrote about, I think it was about 5, 6, 7 years ago, was that somebody pointed out to me, it's not even leaked because it was a public document, but somebody pointed out to me some American oil industry newsletter, and there was this little announcement in it saying the American oil industry has joined with the Jewish community in backing shale exploration, fracking, basically. The Jewish community, we're all in on this. And so you read a little further, and it turned out that the Conference of Presidents under Malcolm had indeed formed a partnership with Harold Hamm, who is this, now he's known as one of Trump's principal supporters. He's an oil man from out west, from the Dakotas. And the funny thing about that, in terms of Jewish consensus, I spoke a little bit about the attempts to make consensus on domestic policy. Well, the current organization that does that is the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, and they actually have a very painful, slow process for arriving at consensus. So they arrive at consensus on very few issues, and one of the issues that they were consensus against was fracking. And suddenly you had this thing where this newsletter was able to say, "Oh, we've got the Jewish community. We're partnered with the Jewish community. They like fracking." So that was, that just signified the degree to which I think the conference had embedded itself in a sort of, a right-wing establishment that was, separate from a Jewish community that is largely liberal. And I think, that was, that's just a trajectory that's just true of the entire mainstream pro-Israel movement with AIPAC, et cetera, where as Israel's government have become more right-wing, and, we've had one that's been right-wing since 2009, they intend to naturally ally with the American right wing because that's what the Israeli right wing does. And nowhere has that been more evident. And I think in Malcolm's alliances with the Conference of Presidents. The other thing that he did, and it certainly wasn't an accomplishment, it pissed a lot of people off, was to the September of 2008, they held an Iran rally. The Conference of Presidents organized an Iran rally in New York outside the United Nations, and they invited Sarah Palin to speak, and they didn't invite Joe Biden to speak. And Sarah Palin was the vice presidential nominee for the Republicans, and Biden. And there was just huge outrage among the conference's constituents. That's just been the story of the conference over the last few decades. This trajectory from really being with the consensus in terms of being pro-Israel and being, so on the issue of Soviet Jewry, to, as the definition of pro-Israel has evolved, not really accommodating it.
So now I want to jump to the recent controversy with Diane Loeb, Wall Street executive, former chair of the board at HIAS, the Jewish Refugee Agency. She gets nominated to be the next chair of the Conference of Presidents, and then all hell breaks loose. And here's what I primarily don't understand, among many things. On its face, a lot of the objection to Loeb becoming the next COP chair had to do with HIAS clashing with the Trump administration over immigration policy and this idea that Loeb may not be the best pick then to liaison with the Trump administration. But you wrote in one of your stories covering this that, quote, the White House, according to a Jewish organizational source, did not object to Loeb as the conference chairwoman as long as immigration was not on the agenda, an easy ask considering the president's conference does not deal with domestic issues, end quote. So then what was or is the actual issue that, like, what was at play? What was this insider baseball?
Well, I think that, I'm not, nobody's actually saying this explicitly on or off the record, but the big professional change in the conference recently is that they brought off William Daroff, who was the Washington director of the Jewish Federations of North America, a very domestic issue oriented organization, although it does pronounce on Israel stuff. And he had been he'd been a member of the Republican Party. He'd worked for Republicans and he'd worked for the Republican Jewish Coalition. And he very ably, once he became the Washington director of JFNA in the mid 2000s, he very ably became what he jokingly calls post-partisan. He's really good at, I think, bringing both wings, the right wing and the left wing of the Jewish community together, which it can be a very difficult and fraught job. And he did that well at the JFNA. And I think, and again, nobody's explicitly saying this, nobody wants to say this out loud, but I think his ambit at the Conference of Presidents is to make it relevant again by pulling it back from the tone deafness that Malcolm has at times exhibited. And so I think that HIAS, which is an organization that has grown over the last few years. It's been, at a time where Jewish organizations, especially legacy Jewish organizations, are shrinking. It's done very well because it's been at the forefront of the immigration issue, which has resonated very much with the Jewish community. And so it's grown in the sense of like fundraising. It's grown in the sense of membership. It's grown in the sense of profile. And I think, completely my analysis, nobody's saying this, but I think that bringing on the ex-chairwoman of HIAS was a signal to the American Jewish community. Like, we listen to you. Even though this is a domestic issue, immigration is a domestic issue, we hear you, and we know that this is a kind of issue that you want to be relevant on, and and that you see as relevant, and that you want to have as the face of the Jewish community. And so they checked with the administration supposedly, and the administration said, whoever you choose, whoever you want, but we're not going to be happy dealing with somebody on an issue like immigration. And they came back and said, well, the conference doesn't deal with immigration. So it's kind of a weird standoff. I really think part of the investment and definitely nobody's saying this on the record, but I really think that part of the investment is that they don't think Trump's going to be reelected. So the upshot is, by having Diane Lobin, you have a president of a former chairwoman of a fairly liberal organization. And, if I'm right, and what they're betting is that Biden wins in November, then they will have somebody who is able to make the Conference of Presidents much more relevant to the American Jewish community, because they will have their access to the White House. I don't know what happens if Trump wins in November as far as that formula goes. But even if Trump wins in November, again, if you look at the trajectory, if you look at what people are doing, it's a way to get the conference to become more relevant to American Jews who really appreciate, where HIAS gets high marks. And of course, there was huge resistance from the people within the organizations, within the conference, the organizations that were friendly to the Trump administration, and they pushed back. And they've got, because HIAS very tangentially allied with some of the harshest critics of Israel in the United States, not on Israel issues, obviously, on immigration issues, they were able to sow a little bit of, I think, worry about this, and so that people wanted to delay the Loeb installation. So she became chairwoman-elect instead of chairwoman, and she'll take up the position next year. That's a formula that the conference never had before, but it's a formula that's familiar to AIPAC.
Can you, because you, in explaining that, are putting a lot of weight on, the considerations of the Conference of Presidents trying to stay relevant, and again, sort of the highest thing. But I mean, really, from the outside, a lot of what it looked like was that Mort Klein, the president of the Zionist Organization of America, had an axe to grind, and he was like leading the charge, and even put on a webinar that, to my knowledge, Arthur Stark then told him to not hold a webinar about criticizing Loeb. And it's just like, can you explain that part of the picture too? Because you put a lot of weight on sort of the institutional reasoning, but I'm wondering about the actual controversy wouldn't exist without this character.
I think that, this character, he contains multitudes. He's the Klein. I mean, he is he's enamored with the Trump administration for the reason that a lot of Israelis are enamored of the Trump administration, and a lot of right-wing Jewish Americans are very. So it's kind of like the superficial reason is the reason, in a sense, that Trump administration has gone more towards right-wing Israeli ideology than any previous president. He recognized Jerusalem as the capital. He moved the embassy there. He recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He exited the Iran deal. He cut off funding to the Palestinians. He's a hero to them. These are something that no other president, Republican or Democrat, would have contemplated beforehand. And so they feel very defensive of him. And I think they were certainly concerned that that somebody who comes from an organization that has been at the forefront of Jewish opposition, even opposition to the Trump administration, that was a concern, because Hayes has joined multiple lawsuits, but actually was the lead litigant in at least 2 lawsuits against the Trump administration's immigration policies. And so, that was a natural concern. It made sense. But there are other elements as well. There's just, even before Trump was elected, a kind of coming together of elements of the right wing of the Jewish community with the right to far right of the wider American community, which from a liberal Jewish standpoint is really dissonant and kind of even crazy. So you have alliances with with Frank Gaffney. I'm sorry, the name of his group evades me now, but it's a right-wing foreign policy organization that is, I think, can objectively be described as Islamophobic in some of its expressions. And frankly, there's been even before the Trump administration, there's been friendship and closeness between groups on the Jewish right and the COA and Frank Gaffney and his warning of Sharia coming to the United States. This is something that some of these groups have really bought into. And so here is a group, Hayes, who in the current moment, because of the turmoil in Syria, and the way that Mort Klein depicts it, it's like he thinks that Hayes has Jones about wanting to bring Muslims into the country, as opposed to the fact that the greatest refugee crisis of recent years just happens to be from Muslim countries. If you have this, I think this thinking that has just developed over the last 20 years that Muslims pose a threat, and it's infected the Jewish right. The big picture is that the American ideological Jewish right wing has aligned itself to a deeper degree than I think a lot of people recognize with the overall right wing and even the far right.
So I just want to push a little bit more into that and come back to, again, the core controversy around Diane Loeb. And you sort of brought up the administrative side and then the Mort Klein side, but it almost feels like you're putting it like 50-50, like both parts were part of the controversy. And again, I mean, really from the outside, it does look like there wouldn't have been any controversy or issue or inside politics if Mort Klein and, the other right-wing organizations didn't have an axe to grind and it looks from the outside like just a bunch of pettiness. And I'm trying to, get more out of you about this, because not only is Klein at the center of a lot of COP and Jewish drama, but more broadly, I just don't understand what any normal Jew outside of the conference is supposed to take away from this weird expression of insider baseball. I mean, you covered it. It's news. I guess institutional Jews are angry about it, but I can't help but look at this and just think it's stupid, empty drama. I mean, it's when it's like, this is always institutional Jews talk about how do we make ourselves relevant to American Jewry. And then stuff like this happens, how do you even begin to actually explain what's going on? Can you offer any sort of further insight into how to make sense of this?
Well, I think that it's what you're expressing, I would say, is probably what a lot of organizations on the liberal and the centrist side of Conference of Presidents are expressing as well. Like, can't we pronounce on something and make everybody else feel good rather than show ourselves to be a bunch of bickering fools? I think that's certainly the case, and I think you've had. So first of all, just to say that I think that there is a recognition of that. I think that's you've had over the last few months, not just in terms of the Loeb hiring or the election of Diane Loeb, but in terms of a couple of other expressions. You had a statement of unity that came out during the pandemic that the conference put out. It was kind of a kumbaya statement. Look, we can all get along on this one issue. An attempt to sort of leave the bickering behind and see bigger picture. Very interestingly, I think for the first time ever, I'm sure for the first time ever, the conference put out a Juneteenth statement. And so, but so what's behind, why does it always devolve into bickering? Who knows? Maybe we'll figure it out. Maybe they won't devolve into bickering. But there are two things. First of all, there are organizations. If you're an organization within the conference, and you're an organization that has political friends in high places and fundraising friends in high places, I think it's very difficult to push that organization, to marginalize that organization. They're going to raise their voices. There's going to be bickering, and it's going to get back to that. So the Zionist Organization of America is, maybe the one semi-major Jewish organization that is in good with the Trump administration. So right now, like just cutting off the ZOA and saying, that you can stay in the conference, but you're no longer relevant, at least at this point, is not an option. It's also tied to some major Jewish funders like Sheldon Adelson, one of the richest men in the world, and a guy who makes or breaks Republican candidates, who's given huge amounts, and this is significant, huge amounts, not just to the organizations that he likes, like the Republican Jewish Coalition or the ZOA, ideologically is aligned with, but to organizations that do have a kind of consensus support in the Jewish community. He's given huge amounts of money to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Israel. He's given huge amounts of money to Birthright, the organization that brings young Jews to Israel for free. So you marginalize the ZOA at the risk of alienating somebody who is very important to the broader Jewish community and not just the right-wing Jewish community. You're always going to have this tension that some of the wealthiest and by dint of their being the wealthiest, the most influential people in the Jewish community are on the right, and they are at odds with the broader Jewish community.
So then, to draw all of these different strands together, not a lot of policy victories necessarily over the past 15 years. The political polarization afflicting the Jewish world, which is also what you're bringing up. But I don't know a nice way to say this, but if the organization ostensibly about presenting a cohesive Jewish voice when it comes to lobbying on Israel and non-domestic issues, if that organization does not have a cohesive Jewish voice, at what point is it just irrelevant? And again, keeping in mind, even you struggle to give significant policy successes of this organization over the past 15 years. And then to come back again, you mentioned Diane Loeb was elected as chair-elect, but it's peak absurdity, again, looking from the outside, to have a candidate for chairperson who goes through all of this drama about being objected to by right-wing organizations. Then she is overwhelmingly confirmed by a vote of 31-8, but confirmed as chairperson-elect instead of just chairperson like it was before. And this is painted as some big compromise for Jewish unity. It's not even polarization, it's shenanigans. I'm just so confused about it. And at the end of the day, given all of this, why should any of us actually care about this organization and what happens to the COP? What does it matter at the end of the day?
I'd say, who knows if it matters, first of all. It might not matter at the end of the day. It might eventually disappear. There are people who are saying it's just time to admit that the Jewish community is fractured and umbrella organizations are not, not the same, don't have the same value they had back in the 50s and the 60s. The people who would argue against that would say that it's important to have, when there is a crisis that really would unite the Jewish community, it's important, first of all, to have a group there, the structure of a group there to express the Jewish community's point of view. That would be one thing. And in the short term, I think the strategy with Loeb, and again, nobody's telling me this, but I'm assuming, is that Biden gets elected. Biden himself is pro-Israel. There are elements within the Democratic Party whose voice are rising that are much, much more critical of Israel than any other the American mainstream has ever been. And so with Diane Loeb, you would have somebody who is friendly to the Biden administration, who is influential, who would be able to go into Biden and say, put a stop on this, whatever this development is, cutting aid to Israel. Just make sure you stop it. And I'm speaking really now for the entire Jewish community. I'm speaking for Americans for Peace Now. I'm speaking for ZOA. I'm speaking for everybody in between, AIPAC, the Reform Movement, the Conservative Movement, the Orthodox Movement. you have to stop this now. You will lose significant Jewish support if you don't stop this. And that would be like her value added, because she's perceived as friendly to the Democratic president, if there is a Democratic president. Conversely, and then the other, development in which the conference, and this is the same as in 2005 with the Gaza pullout, Biden launches a peace process, let's say, and gets an Israeli government, led by Prime Minister Benny Gantz or somebody like that, who is interested in the peace process and who wants to engage, and gets a Palestinian leadership that wants to engage, and everybody's on board, and it's about to go forward. And, a lot of this is fantasy. It's probably not going to happen, but in case it does happen. And then conversely, you have Diane Loeb, who can come in and say, I can get everybody except for the ZOA. I'm never going to get the ZOA, but I can get everybody, going from me through AIPAC, through Reform Movement, through the conservative, and even the Orthodox Jewish movements, to say, you know what, go ahead, this is important. And so we have your back. And that's also, and that also would be a point where a relatively unified conference would be important. So in both cases, that's when it proves its utility, if that ever comes to that. Of course, that's neither, certainly the peace process situation is by no means a certainty, and even the stemming the rise of Israel criticism in the Democratic Party is by no means a certainty, although with the Biden presidency, which it would probably be more likely. And so you have the so that would prove the utility of the conference.
That's a lot of what ifs, though.
Like I said, and the other what if is that, like the American Jewish community could come to a decision that it is truly deeply fractured, and that there is no need for umbrella organizations anymore. And it's like the conference might no longer be relevant. This might be its last hurrah, the whole business of Diane Loeb and hiring William Daroff, etc. So, I don't know.
And just to circle back, I mean, there's when it comes to Mort Klein and the Zionist Organization of America, there's a lot of internal politicking over. There's a complaint against the ZOA from Hayas and a counter complaint in the organization. And now everyone's out to get Klein because of tweets that were, I don't want to just call it racist, allegedly racist towards Black Lives Matter. And there's a, push to get ZOA thrown out of the Conference of Presidents. Can you just give how likely is that actually to happen? You sort of touched on it, but I just want to get a more direct, what should we actually expect to see in terms of any consequences for the ZOA?
I don't know. I mean, it's like the process supposedly, and the thing is that conference is always changing its processes. Nothing's ever written in stone. So the ZOA last year already got a private reprimand, one that wasn't supposed to be leaked, but of course was leaked, and because this is a Jewish community. Then the next stage is a public reprimand. If Mort keeps on being Mort after that and things don't get better, the next stage is suspension. And if that keeps going on, the next stage is expulsion. And that would take 70% of the conference members. And again, the whole thing I said about people not loving the ZOA, but not wanting it to alienate its funders, you could have an organization like AIPAC where the representatives of the conference might be dreaming privately about having a conference of presidents without the ZOA. But I think they would be very wary of actually expelling the ZOA. I mean, I think the way that Mort really shoots himself in the foot is he kind of makes it easier for people to go to, let's say AIPAC, to go to some funders who might be more sympathetic to Mort's point of view, and he makes it easier because he gets so personal in some of his attacks. I mean, if I don't know what's going to happen with the ZOA if Biden gets elected, because Mort has been part of a cohort on social media that has basically been saying that Joe Biden is mentally deficient. So in that kind of situation, I can see maybe there's a possibility that AIPAC and other organizations who are in the center right can go to their donors and say, it's not that we disagree with Mort on ideology, but his tactics have made him toxic with this new Biden administration because he's so personal, in his attacks on Biden. And so, and that might be persuasive to, in terms of the representations to their donors. And so he's been personal in his attacks on on others as well. That's what the Conference of Presidents found last year with its private reprimand. And if they keep on finding that, then they can depict it as just a matter of we can't function with this kind of attack. Never mind the ideology behind it. We can't function with this character of attack, of character attacks. So that might be toxic to the ZOA.
So my last question then for you is just, can you talked a lot about sort of the what ifs, the grand strategy with Diane Loeb, and if Biden becomes president, can you just say sort of on a basic ground level, what should American Jews expect from the Conference of Presidents moving forward?
Well, here's the thing. It's like, one of the, it's kind of parallels, it mirrors one of the arguments that HIAS has in its defense against Mort's attacks, or the ZOA's attacks, because one of their attacks is like, the HIAS, why does HIAS even exist? Because there are no Jewish refugees anymore. Everything's more or less been solved. And HIAS will say, in addition, HIAS has all sorts of ideological reasons for representing refugees who aren't Jewish, but they'll also say it's a practical matter. We need this infrastructure in place in case there's another threat to Jews can emerges. And frankly, there are potentially a lot of places that they can emerge. And so the same goes for the Conference of Presidents. Right now, you've got two parties that are essentially pro-Israel, that have agreement on a lot of issues, in terms of defending Israel. Why do you really need a Conference of Presidents right now? It's just going to reveal fractures within the Jewish community about Israel rather than getting anything accomplished. And the idea is you need this infrastructure in place. You need this consensus organization in place if there is ever a real threat to Israel. If there really is, or there are the same thing as HIAS, if other foreign policy type threats to Jews emerge, if there's, God forbid, like, if a Le Pen gets elected leader of France, there's a sudden crisis for the Jewish community, for a 600,000 strong Jewish community, 700,000 strong Jewish community, you need an organization in place to say, this is a red line, and we have to get the American government to do this on this particular issue. And so you need the troops in place, even if they're fighting even if they're bickering over the small issues. When the big issues come up, we need the troops in place to have a consensus. And so that's probably the best argument for the conference. And it's a hard argument to make, right? Because who can predict the future? It's you're talking about like imagining crises that could happen that aren't happening right now.
This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.